So good evening, everyone. My name is Brunine Lloyd, and I'm with Northwatch. We're a regional organization in Northeastern Ontario, and this is our 2023 Nuclear Waste Online webinar series. It's our 11th year, and we convene a series of weekly webinars or online workshops about nuclear waste issues in Canada. And we started this really because it was hard to travel in Northern Ontario in the winter months. And it's, I think it's a tradition that has served us well, particularly through a couple of years of global pandemic. And this evening, our session is the second for 2023, and it's Nuclear Neighbours. And I'm really very, very pleased to have with us speakers, Peter Harris from Citizens Against Radioactive Neighborhoods in Peterborough, Faye Moore from Concerned the Port Hope Community Health Concerns Committee, and Hendrickson from Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County and area. And they're going to each be speaking and talking about their experience and observations as a community that has a nuclear facility and nuclear operator in their midst. These are important lessons for all of us to learn and understand. And I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Peter. So Peter Harris from Citizens Against Radioactive Neighborhoods, welcome. And if you want to share your screen and begin, that would be great.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
It's just coming, yeah.
Okay, so as you heard, my name is Peter Harris. I'm a resident of Peterborough, Ontario, and I'm a neighbor to a Class 1 nuclear facility. My children attended a school that is 25 meters from this Class 1 nuclear facility, and I am a member of a local citizen group called CARN that is opposed to the expansion of the nuclear facility in Peterborough. I'm also a retired science teacher, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what my bent is. Peterborough's nuclear history began with General Electric manufacturing. General Electric manufactured primarily motors and generators in Peterborough. It expanded tremendously through the years, and eventually 6,000 workers were employed here. Peterborough was very much a company town, but GE's obligations always remained with the shareholders. Over the years, the Peterborough GE campus became highly contaminated with PCBs, heavy metals, trichloroethylene, amongst other contaminants. In GE's approach in conjunction with the Ministry of the Environment was to cap the site with asphalt. This approach was similar to what happened in the United States. This graphic that I've got on this slide is taken from Harper's in 2009. And Harper's in that article was very critical of GE's approach to contamination. Well, parts of GE's site were well known by workers to be dangerous. Peterborough is also known to be a hub of cancer in the 70s and 80s, but Workmen's Comp in Ontario rejected most claims coming out of the plant. An example of how GE covered up issues can be found in the way that they handled asbestos. GE publicly denied that it ever distributed asbestos from the plant, but privately it was known that if there was asbestos in your home, you could call a building inspector and have the building inspector file a report and receive compensation from GE. An enterprising local citizen searched microfiche and found an advertisement in the local paper that indicated that GE had been selling asbestos from the 1940s to the 1970s. So hundreds of homes were affected, and GE finally accepted responsibility for cleanup. It wasn't until the Toronto Star covered legacy contamination and workers' health that there became a political concern for ex-workers. Issues at the site are ongoing, with leachate from the site appearing in local waterways. So this is a Google Maps image of our facility. It's pretty well the very geographic center of Peterborough. It's a downtown facility. So the facility's in the lower middle part of your screen. To the lower left, you'll see a very large parking lot, which is not really a parking lot, but that's the cap, one of the caps that they put on contaminated soil. What you can't see here is that there's a hill on the side of this parking lot. So effectively, any rainwater percolating down from the hill would go under the parking lot and push the contaminants towards Little Lake, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So this is the school that my kids went to. The distance between the Class 1 nuclear facility on the lower right to the school is 25 meters. And I believe it's the only facility like this in the world. This is a view along the street, Monaghan Street. And on the left-hand side, you'll notice this is the beryllium stacks for this facility, and we'll talk about that some more. Immediately to your right, on the right part of the screen, is where the junior playground of the elementary school is, so on the hard right. This is a view down Wolf Street, and again, I don't think there's any other Class 1 nuclear facility in the world that is this close to residential housing. It's about 20 meters between this facility and the housing on the street. And finally, we have a view from the playground. So on the left shoulder of this child, you'll see the corner of the nuclear facility. I'm showing this quote because one of the things that we commonly hear from CNSC and staff at this facility is just how safe natural uranium is. The narrative is that natural uranium emits little radiation. But I guess the engineering staff at this facility have different ideas from CNSC staff and from their supervisors. Another thing I'd like to point out is that GE Hitachi generally responded to safety risks rather than anticipating them. At least this was my experience with this facility. So, you know, parking a facility in downtown Peterborough is an example of how you're not anticipating risks, you're responding to them. GE Nuclear was formed in 1955. Peterborough was established as a site of nuclear fuel bundle manufacture, while the Toronto facility manufactured the pellets that were inserted into the bundles rather. So pellets were made in Toronto, and then they're brought to Peterborough and put into the bundles and sealed here. Peterborough has never had an environmental assessment for its nuclear facility. And in 2007, GE Nuclear merged with Hitachi to form GE Hitachi. Rebranding helped GE Nuclear distance itself from the legacy issues at the Peterborough site. Communication with the local public is a license condition for Class 1 nuclear facilities. GE Hitachi in Toronto and Peterborough did little to draw attention to itself as a nuclear manufacturer. Homeowners and tenants were often surprised to learn that they invested in housing that is adjacent to a nuclear fuel processing facility. Under GE Hitachi, there was a pattern of overstating the amount of public communication to the CNSC. And communication is really one of the few license parameters that we can actually measure as neighbors of these facilities. One of the reasons why I'm here today is because the president of GE Hitachi Canada told the CNSC at hearings that GE Hitachi had excellent relations with the PTA at Prince of Wales School. The school didn't even have a PTA. It was a parent council, and my wife sat on parent council at that school for 7 years and did not miss any meetings. She couldn't recall any communication from GE Hitachi, and other parents that I communicated with repeated her observations.
Peter, can I interrupt for a moment, please?
Sure.
We're getting a couple of comments asking if you can center your screen. Maybe if you change your view to maybe 80%. Right now, where the right-hand part of your screen is being cut.
Okay, 1 second. I've got too many screens running here.
Sorry.
How was that?
That's perfect. Great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So in 2016, BWXT, an American manufacturer of reactor components of the American Navy, for the American Navy, purchased GE Hitachi. At the time of the purchase, Pickering was slated to close in 2021. This would mean the BWXT bought the business knowing it was about to lose 50% of its market. So this raises questions about what exactly BWXT's plans are. So CNSC, unfortunately, doesn't require business plans when handing out 10-year licenses. So no business plans for 1 year, 2 year, or 3 years in a 10-year license. We're left to speculate about what BWXT is up to. There are some things that we do know, however. First of all, the nuclear industry is pressing hard to build SMRs. And we know that there's no SMR design currently seeking regulatory approval that uses natural uranium. We also know that bringing enriched fuel into our neighborhood would compound the risk for our neighbors and kids, as enriched fuel is known to be much more dangerous. The other thing is that it takes years to process applications for new nuclear facilities. If BWXT were seeking to manufacture fuels for new reactors in a location other than Peterborough or Toronto, it certainly would have done so by now. So we in Peterborough have to ask, what are BWXT's plans? In 2019, BWXT made an application to the CNSC to expand its Peterborough license to allow pelleting. BWXT would then consolidate its Peterborough and Toronto facilities to one location. Pelleting releases much more uranium dioxide dust than currently happens in Peterborough. For this application, there was a record number of interventions filed for the license, more than license renewals in Pickering, Darlington, and Bruce. And as we found out, this site is grandfathered. So the siting rules that have been established by the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which are intended to protect the vulnerable in schools, seniors housing, and residential housing, were consequently not applicable here. This despite the manufacturing process being completely different from existing processes and the need to remodel the facility. All parties involved in the hearing agree that pelleting in Peterborough would expose children to increased levels of radioactive uranium dust. The next few slides deal with some of the problems that we had with the associated hearing in Peterborough. And one thing that we believed in Peterborough as we came into the hearing was that the decision was likely preordained. So what was safe in Toronto had also to be safe in Peterborough, although we held out some hope that the proximity of a school might sway the majority of commission members. This was not the case. This hearing was conducted in Peterborough only after Carn fought to have it in Peterborough. The commission, as it was structured in Peterborough, is shown in this slide. To the left is an MD with 3 master's degrees. 2 lawyers sit beside him, a master's in engineering degree with an MBA, just what you want, presiding over a license hearing as an MBA. 2 PhDs beside that, and 2 PhDs in engineering, and another master's in engineering with an MBA. I'm telling you this because somehow the CNSC believes that putting these academics on a raised pedestal and expecting citizens from an underprivileged and underserved neighborhood to come forward with their written and verbal concerns is a fair process. Let's look at how nuclear regulators around the world handle risks associated with fuel processing in their countries. All the following slides show fuel manufacturing sites elsewhere in the world. I've tried to keep the scale about the same in each photo. But this slide shows you how the English regulator, the British regulator, handles risk. Notice all the green around this class 1 nuclear facility. This is Spain. It should be noted that fuel manufacture in most jurisdictions outside of Canada use a hydrogen-argon mixture to mitigate the risk of hydrogen explosion at their fuel sites. After the hearings in Peterborough, we found out about 2 such explosions that occurred in Toronto, one of which caused the evacuation of Neighbours. This is Sweden's idea of risk mitigation. That, by the way, is located in an industrial park. Argentina. The States in. This is in North Carolina. This is actually a GE Hitachi facility, which their website notes is nestled on 1,500 acres. I don't know why they'd mention that if it wasn't important. This isolated Westinghouse facility has a storied history of leaks, spills, and other mishaps. Finally, we have Peterborough's facility. Canada's nuclear regulator clearly will accept risks that other regulators will not. In spite of the fact that we use a higher risk manufacturing process than elsewhere in the world, the CNSC is comfortable with those risks being in residential areas. Next, we'll focus on beryllium. This is a quote from CBC's documentary, Town of Widows, which I'd encourage everybody to have a look at. It should be on CBC Gem still. So the video, the documentary is called Town of Widows. Okay, we're going to go back to these stacks now. There are 3 stacks here. They're beryllium stacks. Again, the school is to the right, 25 meters away. For 20 years, I've been asking why this facility's most dangerous emission is released next to a sidewalk. And I've yet to receive an answer to that question. A little bit about beryllium. It's known as a class 1 carcinogen, and in very small quantities, it results in chronic beryllium disease, which is an autoimmune disease that forms granulomas in the lungs. In 2017, the beryllium safety standards were reduced by 40 times to reflect a new understanding about the safety of beryllium. Safety levels have been dropping consistently with beryllium. In 2000, the US Department of Energy admitted that it's been colluding with the nuclear industry in underestimating the effects of beryllium on nuclear workers. In the CNSC process, staff compile a report before license hearing. In this report, they make a recommendation as to whether or not the license should be approved. In this case, CNSC staff recommended that BWXT's license be expanded because emissions were well characterized and protective of the environment. The problem was CNSC staff had not analyzed their own environmental monitoring program results for a pattern. If they had, they would have seen a disturbing upward trend in beryllium deposition in the playground of Prince of Wales School. Concern about the rising levels of beryllium in the playground of the school was raised by a former Canada Council Research Chair in Environmental Modeling, Dr. Julian Ahern. Dr. Ahern just happens to live in the vicinity of this facility. Dr. Ahern determined that safety standards for airborne beryllium were likely exceeded in order to observe the increases that were seen in soil beryllium. Further analysis of CNSC's environmental monitoring program indicated a lack of controls, poor sampling techniques, discarding samples to make corroboration impossible, massive errors in results, and guaranteed statistical irrelevance due to small sample sizes. I should note here that massive errors were found after the hearings to make the spike in beryllium seem less severe. On 2 more occasions, spikes in detected beryllium were likely large enough to have exceeded safety standards, without any indication from the CNSC that there was need for alarm. The CNSC continues to cite soil standards for safety rather than airborne standards. Soil standards are irrelevant to our concerns about airborne beryllium. This next graph shows you just what the CNSC was up to here. It's a graph that obviously is trying to show you error. This is all they're showing here. They're not looking for trends, which is what we were concerned about. We were concerned about increases in beryllium in samples around our school. If we take these same results, these are the CNSC results, and here's my own graph, this is what we see. And there's an obvious upward trend in these values. So it's obvious what the CNSC was up to, and it's obvious what it wasn't doing. It wasn't looking for trends. And it should plot data to show trends. That's what it should be up to. This next plot shows you, the next plot shows you all the data. So this is an average of all the data over the 7 years that we have results for. And the CNSE is denying that there is a statistically significant increase in beryllium around this school. This quote shown here is taken from the CNSE website. It says that the CNSE is a quasi-judicial administrative tribunal that focuses on the safety and health of workers and the public and the protection of the environment. The use of the word judicial here suggests impartiality, but how impartial can commission members be if they are biased by training and employment? If the CNSE is truly focused on safety, health, and protection of the environment, shouldn't it be training commission members or looking for commission members that are trained to reflect this emphasis? In 2020, the Commission released its decision regarding the license expansion of BWXT in Peterborough, and not surprisingly, the CNSE supported BWXT's application. However, its decision was unusual in that there was a split, with one member of the Commission opposed to the license expansion. The dissenting voice came from the person who was most qualified to speak to the health issues associated with this facility. Let me ask you, as the audience members, which commission member do you believe on this slide believes that exposing a vulnerable population to an increased level of uranium dioxide violates social trust? And I think it's fairly obvious from the composition of this commission which one was opposed to the nuclear facility expanding in Peterborough. As is allowed by the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, the decision to allow the expansion of BWXT's facility was appealed to the federal court by CARN in partnership with CELA, the Canadian Environmental Law Association. If any of you have ever applied for a building permit, you will know that before you do anything, an applicant needs to submit building plans. In this way, the municipality knows how your structure is going to impact its neighbors. Similarly, CARN argued that before this license was approved, the CNSE should have viewed building plans so that emission points could be known and so that they can model the risks. Without first seeing the plans, how could the CNSE know what the issues were? This was our legal case. Unfortunately, the court agreed with BWXT. This quote is from the federal judge and who presided over our case, and it suggests how hopeless our situation is. Common sense really doesn't seem to prevail in CNSE decisions. Here are some quotes from the dissenting voice in the CNSE decision. The principle of justification is the reason why the dentist doesn't x-ray your kid's teeth every time you go in to see the dentist. This principle says that exposing an individual to increased levels of radiation must have more benefit to the individual than harm. Allowing BWXT to expand its Peterborough facility would expose kids and neighbors to increased levels of radiation with no benefit. Here is the CNSE majority response to Dr. Demeter, citing the principle of justification. The majority is of the view that BWXT is entitled to determine how best to conduct its business. This is Canada's CNSE, and with this quote, I conclude my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Peter. A sobering presentation. And now we're going to move on to Faye Moore in Port Hope. Will, by all expectations, also provide us with a sobering presentation. And I have to say, I'm just so grateful to the residents of these communities who are so diligent and so determined to track the proponent, the licensee, and the commission. So, Faye, would you like to start sharing your screen, and I'll introduce Faye Moore, a longtime resident, activist researcher from Port Hope, and with the Port Hope Community Health Concerns Committee. Go ahead, Faye. Faye, your microphone is off. Great, you're starting to share screen.
Am I sharing the screen?
You are sharing your Zoom screen. There you go.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, you've got it, Faye. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Brene, and thank you for the invitation. I'm Faye Moore. I'm the chair of the Port Hope Community Health Concerns Committee. We formed around 1994, concerned about the health of the people in Port Hope with the presence of the nuclear industries. At the time, the emphasis was on the waste. That was what the discussion was about. So our theme tonight is being nuclear neighbors. I'm going to be going back and forth a little bit in time. I hope you can, I do have a bit of a blizzard of slides coming, but I think in this case, looking at the pictures tells a lot of the story. So in Port Hope, we have basically 4 nuclear neighbors, if we want to call them that. So we have the Cameco uranium conversion facility, which has a 10-year license that expires in 2027, and it's been situated, involved with radium first in the 1930s, then uranium refining, uranium processing, and now conversion since the 1930s, and they have a 10-year license. The Cameco fuel manufacturing facility is located on a highway, again in Port Hope. It was just granted a 20-year license by the CNSC from a hearing last November, which authorized a 24% production increase. And it has been sited there with previous owners, Zircotec and Westinghouse, since 1957. And it is licensed to have natural, depleted, and enriched uranium compounds. There's a Cameco storage area, which is site number 3 that is licensed, situated in a neighborhood, and it goes along with the 10-year license expiring in 2027. Our other big neighbor is the Port Hope Area Initiative under AECL that is operationalizing, excuse me, a $1.2 billion federal cleanup of approximately 1.8 million cubic meters of historic El Dorado radioactive waste throughout the community. At the time that the legal agreement was signed in 2001, there were 3 municipalities affected. Now there are 2, and at a hearing last November, they were granted an amalgamated license for 10 years. So we live in the buffer zone of Cameco conversion facility. The same lack of principles applies in Port Hope as it does in Peterborough. There's another view beside the Ganaraska River, where usually there would be in the spring, summer, fall, many fishermen, boaters, people walking, strolling with babies along the river. This is the fuel manufacturing facility on Highway 2, which again, it's in a business area and a neighborhood. This is the storage area. There is a sign now posted on the fence that the cylinders are all emptied of uranium. That's a little hard to believe, but they weren't always, if they are today. And this is an aerial view that's on the Port Hope Area Initiative website of the proposed long-term storage facility for the waste, which we know is already too small for the waste that is in Port Hope. So we have key concerns about our nuclear neighbors. At the time that we formed as a committee, the focus was on the waste, but what we began to see were excellent documents produced by the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, where they had done phytotoxicology work, and they had done annual work on vegetation and air monitoring. And so we began to also expand our focus to what is coming out of these plants and where is it going. Now, all of these key concerns have been raised to the regulator repeatedly when the license periods were, first of all, 2 years, then 5 years, then 10 years. Now it's 20 years. All of these have been raised over and over again, and none of them can be resolved unless the company's move. There were recommendations made. Dr. Gordon Edwards joined with us and made presentations to the CNSC last November. A federal compensation fund be established for the forgotten current and former Port Hope residents and workers, that all private property files must disclose all investigation data on neighboring municipal roads and frontages, and that I will get to more of that in a minute. Post-contamination data on public properties. Make the cleanup mandatory, which it currently isn't. People can opt out because it's just not convenient. They have made noises that they would like to change the cleanup criteria to make it faster and easier for the cleanup to conclude, and we strongly object to that. And the cleanup criteria involve uranium and arsenic, where the proposed changes. They seem to be limiting it now to arsenic. They had wanted to leave 100 parts per million as the standard, and they've lowered that to 58 parts per million, but they also took that off of the license discussion, and they're going to circle back with that maybe in a year or so when there is no public process. We asked that they finally apply the precautionary principle. We asked that the Cameco facilities be relocated, that they should not be grandfathered where they are. And the CNSC response is that they don't have anything really to do with location. We object to the false dose estimates that are applied to the average Port Hope radiation exposures that are used to dismiss documented elevated rates of diseases. And we ask that there be an independent audit of the AECL actions to date on cleanup, determining what the future needs really are, and a federal commitment to the costs and the timeline. Now, one of the things we were successful in pushing for back in the late 90s, early 2000s was statistical analysis. And what showed up were very troubling Port Hope Health Study findings, with Port Hope elevated rates of diseases in selected periods and cohorts. I won't go through that list. Again, there was a Great Lakes Health Effects program study done under the IJC auspices. And there were a number of causes of death, 86 to 92, significantly higher than Ontario. It really ran the gamut. And this is a list of the diseases that were elevated in that study, the Port Hope Harbor area. Dr. Eric Mintz was an independent epidemiologist who we asked be funded to do an independent peer review. And the Atomic Energy Control Board did provide funding to him. He was accepted as a peer reviewer. And these are some summary findings that he made that said that the findings taken together show a pattern that is quite suggestive of an excess of brain cancer in Port Hope. And then the final point, that the available evidence points to there being problems in Port Hope. So what was obviously needed was further follow-up and also prevention. Now, coming out of the hearing last November, in the record of decision for Cameco, the CNSC saw fit to make the following statement: that although the Commission acknowledges the concerns raised by the intervener, which was the Health Committee, and notes the differences between the conclusions of health studies, such as those described in their synthesis report, prepared by their staff, and the lived health issues of individuals, which is the reality, they concluded that it's much better to study the health of a broad population over many years. The conclusions are more meaningful, rather than focusing on the results of individual analysis, which led them to conclude, for the purpose of the license renewal, the Commission is satisfied that the health of people in Port Hope is protected. Now we'll go back and do some history. This is what I remember growing up: the beach in Port Hope, beach house, canteen, there was a ball diamond, a parking lot, and El Dorado is the red building in the background. In 1976, there started to be a a reveal of the contamination outside of Port Hope, first of all, with cattle dying. Different organizations like Energy Probe came and helped, and gradually there was disclosure and testing that found a lot of contamination had been distributed around the community. Dr. Douglas Andrews was one of the first, or the first, professor of nuclear engineering at the University of Toronto, came to Port Hope to a public meeting in 1976. He is one of my heroes. He helped to communicate to the people of Port Hope what the dangers were, the risks were, and what they were trying to sell us as a message. At the time, politically, there was backing for a public inquiry, which never happened. Another expert, just a little clipping on the right, came and he told us that, and he was so right, that what we knew at that point was just the tip of the iceberg. So at that meeting, that was the beginning of resident activism, because the emergence of the problem was becoming known. It was also the beginning of some polarization in the community, with people afraid for their jobs, afraid for the stigma, and some people were refusing to have their properties tested. Now, from that night, there were a number of residents who fought valiantly since the 1970s to get answers. Many of those spent countless hours, days, and also under pressure from neighbors, friends, relatives. They eventually, through one leader, Elizabeth Pereira, appealed to the United Nations Human Rights Committee for help, because these locations had no signs, they weren't fenced off, children were playing in them. The response of the Canadian government was to the UN, well, they haven't sued us yet, so you have no jurisdiction. So that, unfortunately, that complaint was dismissed. This beach house, with friends, I helped clean up dead fish along the shoreline to prepare for dances. We painted it, cleaned it, turned it into a youth center. In the 70s, the building was dismantled. It was trucked to Chalk River Dump. The neighborhood beside El Dorado was dismantled quickly, in a matter of a few weeks. And the remediation of the beach area is still not completed today. Dr. Power's school, radioactive contamination on the property was discovered when they did testing in 1976, 1977. There were some officials, not all, at that time, who wanted to pursue further investigation, because there were borehole test results that were exceeding 500 picocuries per liter of air when they bored down through the kindergarten and the gymnasium. Instead of doing that, there was also indoor elevations of radon and gamma. They did not investigate further. They put the lid back on and they left it. And they basically told people that the school was fine. I'm still trying to find out if this property was remediated. I know that it was contaminated. I've seen the evidence of that, but I don't know if it was actually remediated. And I have an access to information request in to AECL for those documents. It is no longer a school, it is housing. The Lions Recreation Center at the time was the only pool in Port Hope where we all took our swimming lessons, and it's one of the major remediation sites. This is an outdoor skating rink that was remediated a number of years ago, and it is still, as you can see on the Port Hope Area Initiative, as the site requiring further remediation. This is the house where I grew up from 1957 until I went away to school. This is the discovery of 4 pipes in the basement and 1 wooden beam. These were the readings taken from those. Now, my blackboard, where I played for hours, was attached to the wooden beam, and it was about 20 inches from a flow pipe. Now, one of the problems that AECL has in cleaning Port Hope up is that material was put in the town dump. It was used by people in house construction, cinder blocks, bricks, stones, things were used. Fill was used, obviously, at Dr. Power's school, other schools. There was a school already closed. St. Mary's School had been closed, built on fill, part of it. So it was very random. And this was random. When my mother asked for the house to be tested, the woman said, well, where do you live? You shouldn't have a problem out there. Well, lo and behold, yeah, we did have a problem. And her brother and his son came and removed that material. He was a builder, and put it out front, and El Dorado workmen came and took it away. Now, these are some maps you're not going to see on the side. There's a legend. And I'm not exactly sure because I cannot read my speaking notes, unfortunately, from the deck I'm using. Some of these are thorium in air from a gamma Bob Inc. Aerial survey of Port Hope that was done in 2001 and a report from 2002. And there is thorium being measured and uranium being measured and an air absorbed dose rate measured over the town of Port Hope. So this was known to AECL. And see, these are all streets. These are all houses. This is all property where people live. This was known to them in 2002. So the legal agreement was struck, and it took time. I didn't mention that in the 90s, there was a siting task force. And along with what the people were pushing for through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s was a cleanup. And there would be no cleanup if it hadn't been for the people of Port Hope pushing for it. Some of the federal employees in Port Hope still maintain there really isn't any health reason. This is like a community thing, you know. The age-old dismissing of the risks and the realities. So this is now, the cleanup ended up bringing the material into Port Hope, just around the corner. Storage facility is being constructed, and now they have a place to take the waste, although it isn't big enough. And so they would like to change the criteria so they can leave more. And we say no to that. So this is what it looks like driving around Port Hope. This is across from a school. This was a remediation site. Now, this was the former town landfill site, was behind that fence. And if you're standing there and you turn to your left, you'll be looking at the Jack Berger Sports Complex, where generations of children now have come to play hockey, skate, and swim. It was the town's main recreation center. And Jack Berger was a former manager of El Dorado, and that land was donated. So a lot of commingling went on behind this fence. I and my sisters, we remember the yellow cake running down the hill. We remember mounds in the dump, and it ran down the hill, which was called Monkey Mountain and is now called Highland Drive. This is the site of a former firefighter museum where lots of Port Hope people volunteered their time. It was contaminated. It was demolished and the wastes taken away. Of course, there were mounds of dirt here, of course, at all the sites blowing around in the wind. This is a street in Port Hope near the lake. All along the street, a good halfway portion of it needed remediation on the south side. People were still living in the houses. This is another street. This is on the west side of Port Hope, very close to Cameco. And the streets pretty much, or the houses are all the way along here, needed extensive remediation. And this work is still continuing. I just discovered this in looking at a document I received, that this is a site that needs to be remediated. This is a staircase down from the east end of town that people used to, or still use, to go downtown. I just took this picture a few weeks ago. This is the waterfront trail beside Lake Ontario. And this is behind those other houses I just showed you. This is a whole field with trucks, dirt, backyards dug up, people living there. This is from recent documents I received from AECL. These are borehole test results. If you look right in the foreground, you'll see a blue dot, and that is the slide set that you saw on the first slide. That's the East Beach Park area. And on the left side, it says, where it says radium, in there is where the fire museum was. So these are all houses down here, and these are borehole results from municipal roads and frontages documents where remediation is still needed. And this is beside the Ganaraska River is on the right. The road on the left coming down is coming down from the dump site I just talked about, and that was a downhill flow. And so you can see that what Dr. Andrews was talking about when he came to town and had warned the RCMP back in 1966 to get the waste off the hill, that it was contaminating the area all around it, was so very true, as showing up in the borehole results. And this is hundreds and hundreds of people who are along that road, who come for every year for Float Your Fanny Down the Ganney, which recognizes the terrible floods that have happened in Port Hope, particularly one in 1980. Now, this is a document from the Gamma Bob report. This is where I lived at number 181 on their map. I was never shown this. I was never told this. I got this through accessed information of municipal roads and frontages. My personal property file did not contain this. So this was my house. And when they were going to put a water main in on Ralston Drive, they knew in 2016, you can see in the pink along there and the yellow, and they acknowledge that there's going to be a problem and they're going to have to do remediation there. And so I had several meetings. I got this information and I talked to them, and they refused to confirm there was contamination on my property. This is in 2017. So we closed on our house sale May 31st, 2017. They did not go in. They refused to go in and test it before we sold. They went in June and tested it. And in July, they were remediating it. And I only got these files some months ago. No one, excuse me, no one ever told me, no one ever called me to tell me that my children, my family, and hundreds of other families on similar properties used and played and mowed the lawn, played road hockey, not knowing. So, like hundreds of other people, other families, I say that because they withheld this information, they placed my family knowingly at risk. Dan is a member of our board. He was a worker at Zircotech, and he has uranium poisoning, as shown through one of our health studies, which was doing urine bioassays with the Uranium Medical Research Center. And it documented that he had uranium-236 in his body, which shouldn't even be in Port Hope. It's the signature of recycled uranium from a reactor, which is, you won't see anywhere in their license back when he was working there. And he's still fighting for compensation from WSIB for uranium poisoning, and Cameco is continuing to oppose him. And we raised that with the commission. Now, the US Department of Justice recognizes harm from uranium and radium exposures in law, And these are the ones so far that they recognize. And we argue that Canada needs to do the same for workers, for nuclear workers, and for community downwinders. But right now, what happens is the industry gets away, and so does the regulator, with pretending this does not happen. On the Canada.ca website today, is background radiation at Port Hope elevated? Here's their answer. So there's nothing that's considered to be a health concern, and the background radiation in Port Hope is within the range found in other Canadian communities. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. So we say it's far past time for the federal government to fully disclose the extent of radioactive contamination in Port Hope and to compensate the forgotten people for the decades of documented malpractice, neglect, and immeasurable harm that is impacted. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Faye. And Faye had said I should interrupt at the 20-minute mark, and I think you can all understand why I didn't. So thank you so much, Faye. We're now going to move on to our third speaker, Dr. Ole Hendrickson from Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County and area. And then we're going to come back for discussion with all three of our panelists. So if you do want to enter your questions into the Q&A now, then we can sort of move right into those after Ole's presentation. And I think Ole, rebel that he is not going to use PowerPoint. So Ole, I'll just hand it over to you. And thank you again so much, Faye.
Thank you, Blaine. Thanks, Faye. Thanks, Peter. After moving to Chalk River in 1983 to take a job as a federal forest scientist at the Peterborough National Forestry Institute, I bought a wartime 6 on the outskirts of Deep River for $24,000, and then I sold it for $32,000 in 1990. My next door neighbor, Ken Watson, was an NRX reactor operator, and he told me he made more money than his brother, who was a senior manager at CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency. And Ken said he could leave work behind when he went home, which his brother couldn't. And his partner was a security guard at CRL. Back in those days, radiation exposures and cancer risks for CRL workers were high, likely associated with tritium in the active area and the failure to accurately estimate tritium doses. CRL worker radiation exposure and cancer data skewed results of an international health study for nuclear workers. And the CNSC is still trying to explain away this high cancer incidence at CRL, denying that tritium has anything to do with it. And I go shopping in Deep River and overhear conversations about who's in the hospital for cancer treatments. Wilfred Bennett Lewis was Senior Vice President for Science at CRL between 1963 and 73. He gave a talk at the packed Mackenzie High School auditorium a few weeks after the April 1986 Chernobyl disaster. Lewis said that Chernobyl showed how few people would be affected even by a major reactor accident. I'd read up on Chernobyl in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and I knew that both it and the December 1952 NRX accident occurred during low power experiments with some control rods removed. So from the very back of the packed auditorium, I asked what I thought was a good question, Dr. Lewis. Could you compare and contrast Chernobyl with the 1952 NRX accident? The auditorium went totally silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Lewis was furious and he turned beet red, and he died the next January. The Deep River Library is named after him. As an environmental scientist, I used to attend lectures at CRL. Leaving one of those, I had to flatten myself against the metal gate of the parking lot when a truck hauling a load of corroded metal speeded into the active area. And I was sick all that winter, so I don't know if that was the cause or not. In 1986, fulfilling an election promise, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney started the Siting Process Task Force on Low-Level Radioactive Waste Disposal, which was subtitled opting for cooperation, though Bernane, I believe you were the one who nicknamed it co-opting for operation.
I did.
And its intent was to find a, quote, willing host community for the Port Hope waste that Faye just talked about so eloquently. Some of that waste was shipped to CRL in the late 1970s and dumped in a ravine. And there was an accident on a local road where a truck lost its load, and that necessitated a cleanup. My partner Lynn and I were on the siting task force community liaison group for Deep River, which was mostly composed of AECL employees. And we watched as all the other communities in the process dropped out. The proposal morphed into the so-called Deep River Disposal Project, which was to be a cavern housing both Chalk River waste and Port Hope waste right next to the Ottawa River. So the town of Deep River entered into prolonged negotiations with Natural Resources Canada, and it insisted on long-term job guarantees for Deep River residents who worked at Chalk River. Lynn served as the secretary for an ongoing joint meeting of mayors from both sides of the river. The Quebec mayors were under the impression that there were absolutely no radioactive releases from Chalk River, and they were pretty shocked to find out that there were. And even the Ontario mayors were unhappy that Deep River stood to get all the compensation for this cavern, but Deep River is upstream of Chalk River. So the Deep River mayor obviously did not participate in the joint mayors committee. Towards the end of that process, Lynn and I went to a somewhat tense meeting with NRCan Minister Anne McLellan. When she came out of her office that morning and met with the delegation, mostly of mayors, it turned out that Lynn and Ann were dressed absolutely identically. She had a red jacket, white blouse, and black skirt, and you could see daggers coming from McLellan's eyes. And finally, the siting process failed around 1993. Our close friend Chris Mitchner did the early work on our group's CCRCA website in the early 90s. He posted maps of radioactive plumes from the leaking waste areas that Norm Rubin at Energy Probe had gotten from a CRL whistleblower. And those plumes are pretty bad. But at that time, the greatest health risk was if you found yourself in the airborne plume from the NRX-NRU reactor stack, which contained large quantities of the powerful gamma emitter argon-41, which is an activation product of non-radioactive argon-40, which is a constituent of the atmosphere. Argon-41 has roughly a 2-hour half-life. So Chris had a radiation meter, and we went driving around the Quebec side in Sheenborough and made measurements one day and stopped at a point where you could actually see the NRX-NRU stack, and the meter just went crazy. The Sheenborough mayor's daughter was driving by. She stopped, demanded to know what we were doing and that we leave immediately. And we were pretty happy, actually, to comply. I did get to know fairly well some AECL employees like Dave Lee in the Environmental Protection Group. And he took me on a tour around Perch Lake and warned me that we didn't want to linger there because of the volatilization of tritium. Dave did some important work intercepting strontium-90 plumes. He always argued that overall pollution levels and quality of life in Deep River were better than Ottawa. I didn't necessarily agree with him, but you did have to sort of be keen on spending time outdoors, skiing, hiking, canoeing. I participated in the cross-country ski loppet one winter, which went right onto the CRL property, and it crossed the pipeline carrying the gaseous NRX-NRU reactor emissions to the tall stack. We were told, move quickly through there. Those were the old days when I lived in Chalk and Deep River. But since moving to Ottawa, I still represent concerned citizens on something called the CRL Environmental Stewardship Council, which started about 15 years ago under AECL and was continued by the new American management of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, which was an AECL subsidiary created by Stephen Harper in 2014. And then in 2015, Stephen Harper's Natural Resources Minister, Greg Rickford, sold AECL to an American-dominated consortium under a 10-year contract. I went on a tour of the CRL in the active area with one of the American managers who had a nuclear submarine background. And I asked him, oh, what's the U-235 enrichment in nuclear sub fuel? And he said jokingly, if I told you that, I'd have to kill you. So that's not the only nuclear facility in our upper Ottawa Valley. In the small town of Pembroke, which is near the banks of the where the Muskrat River empties into the Ottawa, it's a low, conspicuous industrial building with a curious tenant, SRB Technologies, Canada's only manufacturer of glow-in-the-dark lights filled with tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen. SRB began as a branch plant of Saunders and Rowe, a major military contractor which had close ties to the UK and US energy and defense departments. As I said, SRB makes mostly glow-in-the-dark products like exit signs. It fills glass tubes with tritium, and which then the tritium inside the tube strikes a phosphorescent substance inside the tube and makes it glow. Since setting up shop 32 years ago, SRB hasn't received much public attention, and nearby Pembroke neighbors probably still don't know that they have a class 1 nuclear facility for a neighbor, only like 150 meters from some houses. And they might be dismayed to learn that their properties are radioactively contaminated with tritium in water, soil, and vegetation. And they probably stunned to learn that tritium, which is the material routinely handled by SRB, plays a major role in the world's nuclear arsenals. CNSC's precursor, the ACB, gave SRB its first license in 1990. At the ACB hearing, our group warned that tritium light companies had an unsavory history. We cited the case of Tucson-based American Atomics, which radioactively contaminated its neighborhood, including a nearby school, and then made a hasty exit out of Tucson. At that time, Lynn and I lived in Pembroke near SRB. Our Concerned Citizens group in 1990 requested strict environmental monitoring of SRB and ongoing public review of SRB's environmental performance. But AECB ignored us. It granted a license that allowed SRB to release tremendous quantities of radioactive tritium gas during its operations, and it imposed no environmental monitoring requirement whatever. In 1995, SRB began applying for licenses to import waste tritium lights from other countries. And within a month, ACB issued import licenses for multiple shipments of tritium from the UK, from Russia's top secret Mayak weapons facility, and from US weapons facilities. So vast quantities of tritium containing wastes began arriving in Pembroke, and most did come from military operations. They've made lights for temporary airport landing strips and harbors and so forth. Those countries no longer, I guess, needed the glow-in-the-dark military hardware that they had produced using excess tritium from their nuclear weapons programs. So radiation-filled glass tubes piled up at SRB, awaiting their turn to be crushed in an inefficient and poorly designed reclamation rig, which captured about 85% of the tritium and released about 15% to the air. So much radioactive waste went up SRB's stacks and out into the environment. And so far from being a small manufacturer of safety signs, which is what everyone thought, SRB had become a convenient place for nuclear weapons facilities to offload large quantities of hazardous radioactive waste. In 1995, a surprise ACB inspection of SRB revealed widespread tritium contamination, missing stack emissions analyses, and poor storage of waste tubes. Those results were not made public. In fact, for the entire first decade of SRB's existence, the ACB repeatedly renewed SRB's license without public hearings. SRB's tritium emissions rose to staggering levels, and serious environmental contamination was inevitable. We only learned about how bad things were when our good friend Irene Koch, who sadly passed away at Durham Nuclear Awareness, sent us an Access to Information Program request she'd done that yielded over 1,000 pages. We were pretty surprised. We collected rhubarb from a garden a kilometer from SRB and sent it to an accredited lab for tritium analysis. And the lab's finding of 2,000 becquerels per liter of tritium in the rhubarb was, which would be about 1,000 times normal background levels, attracted a lot of public attention when Martin Mittelstadt with the Globe and Mail published a September 1999 story called The Atomic Rhubarb of Pembroke. So SRB, after 10 years, finally appeared before the new Nuclear Safety Commission at a public hearing in 2000 and asked for a 5-year license. Pembroke residents attended in large numbers and complained about radioactive contamination of their properties. The CNSC dismissed concerns. The record of decision from that hearing merely states, quote, numerous interveners expressed concern over what they perceive as unacceptable tritium releases to the environment. The commission accepts CNSC's staff conclusion that tritium levels found in the local environment based on existing monitoring data would result in doses well below the regulatory limit. On New Year's Eve in 1999, after the hearing, the Ottawa Citizen reported that a cylinder of pure tritium gas on its way to the Ottawa airport for shipment to SRB's US owners fell off a Purolator truck on Bank Street, a busy street in Ottawa. A woman motorist saw it and reported it before the cylinder was damaged. If it had been, it could have triggered a widespread evacuation. And I'm speculating now, but in that period of the late 90s and early 2000s, the US had shut down its tritium production reactors at Savannah River and had a fairly acute tritium shortage for its hydrogen bombs. You have to remember it's got a 12.3-year half-life and bombs have to be topped up with tritium regularly. So my guess is that SRB was keeping track of how much tritium they processed in their reclamation rig, and they sent an equivalent amount of pure tritium to the US for weapons, but I have no proof of that. But we do know that tritium originated at the Darlington Tritium Recovery Facility, then was sent to Chalk River's Tritium Lab, and then to SRB in Pembroke, and then to the airport in Ottawa, and then to North Carolina at SRB's owner. So in mid-2005, SRB was preparing to make its case for yet another 5-year license renewal, and tritium levels in garden produce and groundwater were really high. A monitoring well at the base of SRB stack regularly showed hundreds of thousands of becquerels per liter of tritium, and wells used by drinking water by local residents contain thousands of becquerels per liter. Potatoes from a garden several hundred meters from SRB stack contain 10,000 becquerels per liter. Swimming pools were contaminated. Immediately prior to that 2005 hearing, CNSC staff announced that SRB had found an error in their method of calculating reported tritium releases from their stacks. As a result, CNSC staff said, quote, the amount of tritium released to the atmosphere was underestimated by a factor of 10. And that error invalidated all of SRB's tritium emissions since it began operating in 1990. At that 2005 hearing, a CNSC staffer said they were not prepared to support SRB's request for a 5-year license because of, quote, reservations about SRB's commitments towards its responsibilities for radiation and environmental protection. And he said, quote, a substantial amount of regulatory oversight is required to ensure that SRB meets applicable standards. So one might think that would trigger a shutdown of the facility, but what CNSC staff proposed was a 2-year license instead of a 5-year. And the commission actually decided on a 1-year license. And in 2006, something unthinkable happened. CNSC's Environmental Assessment and Protection Division issued an order to SRB to, quote, cease and desist the processing and use of tritium at its nuclear substance processing facility located in Pembroke, based on evidence of radioactive contamination of groundwater. They weren't concerned about what people were breathing from the air, but they were concerned about groundwater. SRB appealed that order, and then at a closed meeting in August later, the commission amended the order and allowed SRB to continue tritium processing. But it required SRB to report on how it would identify groundwater contamination sources and remediate groundwater. So later in 2006, outraged members of the public descended on Ottawa for yet another CNSC hearing. This time, the CNSC shut down SRB's tritium processing activities for an 18-month period. SRB installed new groundwater monitoring wells, and it did fine-tune its operations to reduce tritium emissions. And 18 months later, in 2008, CNSC gave SRB a new processing license, and then in 2010, it renewed the license. In 2015, it renewed the license, and in 2022, it renewed the license. It's now a 12-year license. So during its 18-month shutdown, SRB turned to a Peterborough-based competitor, Shield Source International, SSI, to fill tubes with tritium and then ship those tubes to to Pembroke, where SRB could assemble them into their final products. And beginning in 2010, SSI went through a sequence of events similar to what SRB experienced, because monitoring results were showing really high tritium contamination of the local environment, with readings of 2,500 becquerels per liter of tritium from an apple on a tree 200 meters from the facility, and 200 becquerels per liter from an apple 5 kilometers from the facility. So at a January 2011 review of SSI's license, a CNSC staff spokesperson responded to these findings, quote, "We did observe as well that apples have this unique characteristic of having fairly high tritium concentrations, even far away from some facilities. And this is a subject of, well, will be the subject of some future research efforts to look at how apples are behaving this way," unquote. So then belatedly, CNSC staff looked at SSI's radiation dose estimates and its emissions, and SSI also revealed it had underestimated its emissions by a factor of 10 since it had opened. So in Peterborough, a howl of indignation went up. Citizens mobilized a forceful and effective movement opposing giving the company a new license. And the saga at Peterborough for SSI ended differently than SRB. SSI closed up shop, decommissioned its facility, but meanwhile, SRB hired new staff and it increased its tritium processing. Canada has regulations for implementing the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and those classify tritium as a controlled substance. And as I noted, tritium gas plays a very important role in the maintenance and modernization of nuclear weapons arsenals. By using a tritium spark plug at the heart of a fission weapon, its power can be greatly increased, and tritium is considered essential for the miniaturization of nuclear weapons. Canada is the world's largest commercial producer of tritium. Ontario Power Generation runs the tritium removal facility at Darlington and removes tritium that builds up in heavy water used to moderate CANDU reactors, giving some degree of protection to its workers. According to OPG, quote, "The tritium is safely stored in stainless steel containers within a concrete vault," but is it really? Not when it gets out to SRB. In 1987, before the Darlington tritium removal facility opened, that was in 1990, David Martin wrote an article for Peace Magazine called "Tritium Traffic Deadly Dividends for the Nuclear Industry." He noted there would be a great temptation to sell tritium from the OPG facility, given the very lucrative market for it. And at that time, tritium sold for $15 million per kilogram, which was 1,000 times the price of gold. And Martin questioned whether adequate safeguards were in place to ensure that Canada's tritium would not end up in nuclear weapons. So SRB is still OPG's main tritium customer. In In 2013, it processed 85 grams of tritium, and I think pretty similar amounts since then. This sounds like a tiny amount, but as David Albright and Ted Taylor note in a Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist article, making warheads, a little tritium goes a long way. Only a few grams of tritium are needed to boost the yield of a nuclear bomb several fold. And SRB processes enough tritium each year to supply several dozen nuclear weapons. SRB did finally close its reclamation rig, I think more because of our pressure than the CNSC's. So now emissions are considerably less. Concentrations in wells and local produce are declining, but SRB is still in business, and it still imports waste tritium exit signs from the US, and it sends them now to Chalk River, but doesn't crush the tubes. SRB is one of our 3 nuclear neighbors in the upper Ottawa Valley, along with Chalk River, and also the shutdown nuclear power demonstration reactor, which is further upriver in Rofton. So thanks. I know I ran on a bit long there.
Thanks very much, all. That was really very helpful, very insightful. And I think that there's a couple of themes there through these 3 communities: long, complex histories, really diligent citizen tracking of these issues, documenting these issues, responding to these issues, and failure of response from Canada's regulator. We've got one question. Oh, it's just a word. I think Brad is saying hello, all. I have a question for the panelists, and I'm going to actually make it a twofold question. One is, we've got a real great variety of people participating in the webinar tonight, many of whom don't live in one of the 3 communities. Few live in the 3 communities that our speakers are from. And so the first part of my question is, what can those not in the community do in support? What would be helpful to people living in Port Hope, Peterborough, the Ottawa Valley, that others outside the area might be able to provide in terms of support? The other part of my question is, and I'm going to roll it all into one because we're going to wrap up in a few more minutes. The other part of my question is, we've got a lot of people online tonight who are in the siting area for nuclear waste management organizations, deep geological repository for high-level waste, more who are along the transportation route. And I think all of us are somewhat vulnerable to the nonsensical siting of a small modular reactor. So our 3 panelists are very experienced in dealing with the nuclear industry in their community. What advice would you give to somebody in a community that is being targeted with a nuclear facility? What should they be looking at and thinking about from the get-go, from the very beginning? So twofold question, and I think we'll go maybe Peter, Faye, and Ole in the order of our presenters. So what can those outside do to assist or support your efforts? And what advice would you give to a community that was being newly targeted with a nuclear facility? Peter.
My feelings are that this facility in Peterborough wouldn't actually be here if it weren't for nuclear regulation. I believe the CNSC protects it, and our industrial zoning is, we have a specific plan around development. We have an industrial park. We're supposed to be building in that industrial park, encouraging growth in there, and yet they're allowing BWXT to expand in our neighborhood. So one of the problems with the CNSC is that it's kind of it's a screen for most people to stop thinking, and everybody is deferential to the CNSC. And I think we really need to hold politicians to the fire. Local politicians, federal politicians, and provincial politicians, and we really need for them to understand what the issues are. And they have to stop hiding behind the CNSC. In our case here, they just turn off their brains. And, you know, I don't understand this issue. You know, the CNSC is here to help us, and that's it. And I think there needs to be political pressure. Faye was saying that, and we've done the same, ask the CNSC to encourage them to site themselves in a proper location. And no, CNSC is not responsible for that. I went to my politician, I said, you know, you need to encourage these guys to locate in a proper location, away from children. Oh, I'm a politician. You don't want politicians involved in that. So I guess it's industry that is deciding where to park these things, where they should be. It's not the CNSC, and it appears not to be politicians either.
Great, thanks, Peter. Faye. Your mic's not on yet, Faye.
Thank you. I agree with everything Peter just said. The complete absence, the disconnect of the regulator to the reality of what happens outside of, is it Slater Street in Ottawa, is just shocking. Even when they travel to have a meeting, there's no understanding of the reality. And I guess they're just doing the job that they've been given with the mandate they have to enable. And I think that's a place that we can all tackle together with maybe jointly doing petitions. I think going political at a very high level really is the way to go. Local, they are subject to the pressure from the mayor or the CEO. It's too difficult for people to take a stand. They're also very intimidated by the subject matter. People are made to feel stupid. Talking about radiation, like, who are you? Who do you think you are? We've all been through that. I think just pulling out the stops, going to the Prime Minister, going to local politicians, trying to get media coverage. When Zircotech was going to be a partner with Cameco, and they were going to do the slightly enriched uranium project back around, they started around 2007 in that vicinity. An organization formed around that in Port Hope, Families Against Radiation Exposure, and they did a wonderful job. We partnered with them on stuff. They went door to door. They signed up people and said, do you know what's happening here? And we had a hearing like Peter describes, like numbers. And I, by luck, got a meeting with Stéphane Dion's office, took a Geiger counter with me. We just we went for it, and we went top level, and we had meetings with ministers. And I think to try and get the message across when you have a compelling message to make is the way to go, because we can waste years and years and years. In 20 years, we'll get 10 minutes again to talk about Cameco, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, it's just not going to happen. And I think what people can do to help is when people go in that direction and do the sign-on letters, that I think are great. And you've facilitated a lot of those, Brené, and very appreciated, to send them to the regulators' bosses, both about their incompetence, the improper structure, lack of performance, bias, and that has to change for the longer term. But in the short term, no, do not put these here, and it makes no sense. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks very much, Faye. Oh,
I couldn't agree more. CNSC is a captured regulator. It's an enabler, not a regulator of the industry, and has proven time and again. People, we have to go around the CNSC, and there have been some really promising efforts like the Nuclear Waste Watch campaign to reform the radioactive waste policy that we're still waiting to see what Minister Wilkinson does with all our comments. It's Parliament ultimately that's accountable for the CNSC. It reports supposedly through Wilkinson to Parliament, but Parliament is so hands-off and so supportive of things like SMRs. We were looking at the House of Commons Science Committee's SMR report today, and it's mostly disappointing, I must say. So yes, people can do those sign-on letters. They can put comments in to bodies other than the CNSC. And one thing that's become really important for us, because we're faced with other stuff like the giant mega waste dump at the NSDF at Chalk River, is we've been working with indigenous, local indigenous peoples. And it's been so rewarding for me personally. And they have so much experience at dealing with a whole range of projects on their lands, mines and dams and highways and all that. So, so yeah, if you get any kind of inkling that some project is coming your way, reach out to them and reach out to your neighbors.
Great, good. Faye, you wanted to add something? Thanks so much, Wolf. Faye, you wanted
Yes,
to...
if I could, please. I really can't sing the praises of Dr. Demeter. I understand he did something good relative to Peterborough. But last November, when we were talking about health, and he was the MD, and I looked him up after and read his bio, and he has a specialty in community medicine. And he started down the road of, well, you know, you're really hard to study because you're a small community and you need a big population. And I said, no, we dismissed that years ago, that whole small community thing, that we don't matter, is, in other words, that's where industry should go. And so we need to watch ourselves, because when the regulator thinks there aren't any valid health outcome results that can be got from a small community, you know, you're treated like dog food. So he sat back, and I could not believe, I was just, and I don't know, he didn't appear the next day on the panel for the Cameco hearing. He left after. I don't know what happened there, but I was glad he was gone. But on the other hand, we lost that continuity because we had 2 new panel members for the Cameco hearing after we had just done the AECL CNL hearing. But that mindset from a doctor about Port Hope and health studying and monitoring was really, well, I'll use the word disappointing.
Great.
Major.
Thanks for that, Faye. We're just a little bit after 8:30. We've got 2 questions. Well, we've got 3 questions, but I'm going to combine 2 of them. And then I think we'll wrap it up after that. So the first question is asking about, and this is something that the panelists were discussing just before we opened the session, is the whole overlapping relationships between proponents, licensees, and so on. And this question is asking the panelists, they find it interesting that the former mayor from Port Hope is on the advisory council for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And the questioner asks, what do the panelists think about these kinds of positions taken by leadership people from people in troubled nuclear towns who would actually call themselves nuclear hosts? And there is an association of nuclear host communities who the Nuclear Waste Management Organization frequently wheels out to their advisory, to their community's own committees in their siting regions. Would any of the panelists like to speak to that? Faye, I don't know if you want to start. So what are the panelists' thought on these cross relationships between people of influence in the nuclear communities and other organizations, or the cross relationships between these different nuclear entities? Faye, do you want to?
My experience generally has been, I wasn't aware, and I'm not sure who it was. If it's probably Bob Sanderson, although there was just generally the politicians. It's a very tricky situation because Port Hope wants a cleanup and it needs a cleanup. And you have this octopus of AECL, CNSC, federal ministers. Everybody wants you to play ball. And if they come in and they want to change the criteria, they want to shorten it a bit. I have to say I was pleased with the part of the municipality of Port Hope's intervention for November CNL was they were stressing, like, hurry up, put more resources in, but get it done right. They did not take a position on the criteria change. But yeah, everybody wants to get it done. It's been 50 years. So please. But as far as the cross, I think that's something to be very worried about, because I think it's easy to co-opt people with a carrot at the end of a process where you're needed for decisions. And I think, you know, it's something to be wary of as a way of buying goodwill with the community and people of influence, whether it's a mayor or somebody else. I can see being invited to give input, but to receive what I presume is a paid position, I think is a bit concerning, but I don't know the specific details about that one.
Great. Paul or Peter, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, in Peterborough, we have a long history of GE employees being active on the political scene. One of our current aldermen is a former employee of GE Hitachi Nuclear. Another former alderman didn't rerun this year, works in the nuclear industry as well. So it is certainly a frustration in Peterborough that we have that kind of influence. You know, all we can do is try to expose those relationships. That's about the best we can do. Looking federally, though, the Ultra Safe Nuclear Commission, or the Ultra Safe small modular reactor, isn't it? All it's one of its board members is the former chair of the CNSC. So we see this not just locally, but federally as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and Michael Bender also was hired as a consultant by Canadian Nuclear Laboratories after leaving his position as president and CEO of the CNSC. Basically, everybody in Deep River works at AECL, so you can't find any counselors that are kind of impartial on this. So you have to kind of go further afield, but even all of Renfrew County on the Ontario side is kind of automatically supports anything that AECL CNL asks for. Unfortunately, the Quebec side is so different, though. It's very interesting, and but they don't get the jobs. It's a long commute from even Chapeau over to Deep River or Chalk River. So yeah, we've learned to just live with that.
Okay. Thanks, all. So our last question comes from Lorraine, and Lorraine asked, is there any thought to establish a repository for all this important historical research? It looks like this struggle is a legacy we will leave to the next generation. And I know that Canadian Environmental Law Association has been developing an online resource center. And certainly we've had conversations. Dr. Edwards, Gordon Edwards at Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility has his own sort of library, much of it online. I'm gonna come back to the panelists though. Are there thoughts within your own organizations about how you archive the information that you've been collecting, how you make it available to others and including others in the future? Maybe I'll go opposite this time. Old Faye Peter.
It's embarrassing. I am the world's worst at this. I mean, I've got a collection of USB keys that have, you know, dozens and dozens of documents on them. And yeah, I wish I were better organized and could find the time to do just that. I dusted off my SRB chronology, and that was the basis of much of what I talked about tonight. It wasn't too hard to find, but I had to search around a bit. But it's quite illustrative of how the CNSC still works, in my view.
Faye, and then the last word to Peter.
That's an issue that we've really been struggling with for years. And one of my former colleagues, who was absolutely amazing, Pat Lawson, when she wasn't well, we went through her just treasure trove of documents. And then she had some put in the library and some went in the archives. And I have boxes and boxes of material as well. And it's something I struggle with. We did, as a committee, we got Trillium funding a number of years ago, and we did a collection of newspaper clippings with someone that we hired. And those are available in the public library. But, you know, I almost one of the best ways I guess is through the interventions that we've done to the CNSC in terms of accessibility. And if they would make available, or somebody else had those transcripts and those the webcasts and all of the documentation, they are really an excellent source of information. Now that's just sort of one aspect, but
Yeah, excellent point, Faye.
Mm.
Yeah. I would add to that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and its predecessor, the Federal Environmental Assessment Review Office, for the decommissioning in Elliott Lake, all of the uranium mine hearings in Saskatchewan, the AECL concept review, the DGR1. There's, you know, in the environmental assessment agencies, there's really massive archival materials as well. Last word to you, Peter, about preserving our information resources and sharing them, including with future activists.
Yeah, if this screen's not evidence of it, the anti-nuclear lobby is pretty old. So I really, sorry, I really think we need to get the youth involved in understanding what the issues are and what the history is. So to me, the most important thing is engaging young people in all of these concerns.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to call it a wrap. And thank you very much, Ole, Peter, and Faye. Really great presentations and important lessons for us all to learn and keep in mind. And I think that we've I think Lorraine's put a challenge to us about how are we going to archive and develop this repository of really great information and important information that you three have shared tonight. So thank you very much. I'm not going to share my screen, but I am going to say our third session in the Nuclear Waste Online series is next Wednesday at noon. It's an international session. It's an international panel sharing status of deep geological repository programs in Sweden, the UK, and in the US. So please do join us. Go to northwatch.org to register, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Renee.
thank you, Ola and Peter.
Thank
Thank you, Brennan.